Well, this whole adventure began a couple of years ago when I traveled to the state of Wisconsin to Burnett County. I was going to a wildlife area called Creeks Meadows. Creeks Meadows is located in west central Burnett County. Creeks is 1/2 mile north of the town of Grantsburg, Wisconsin. My purpose in going there was to videotape wildlife in its natural habitat. Creeks Meadows is home to many different species of wildlife. The abundance and diversity of wildlife has made the preserve a wildlife showplace. The land is most diverse and consists of brush prairie, wetlands, and forest. Hi, my name is Terry Vruno, and I invite you to come along with me for an exciting outdoor adventure. Each year, many different species of birds come to creeks to nest. It's a common sight in the springtime to see a lot of Canadian geese and their young. It is not uncommon to see birds such as the bald eagle, the golden eagle, the trumpeter swan, and the sandhill crane, to name a few. Creeks Meadows is a state wildlife management area and is primarily managed for waterfowl and sharp-tailed grouse. I came across a red fox den, and I didn't have to wait long before this kit fox came out to investigate. I was able to get very close with my camera. I spent quite a bit of time with the young fox. The young fox didn't seem to mind my presence much at all, and at one time it almost came into my lap. Well, I soon became so excited about this area that I decided to find a piece of land to buy. I thought that if I found a piece of property, that later on I could perhaps build a cabin. The piece of land that I and my wife Ruth looked at was 2.5 miles from Creeks Meadows. It was located in an area known as the Barrens. This area was referred to as the Barrens because the Scandinavians which settled here tried to farm the land and could not grow much because most of the area is very sandy. The trees in this country are predominantly jack pine and scrub oak. There is approximately 650,000 acres of public land in the Burnett County area, which include the Governor Knowles State Forest and St. Croix River area. The piece of property was only a 40-minute drive from Lindstrom, Minnesota, where we live. Ruth and I both agreed that this was a beautiful area and decided to buy the 12-acre parcel. Winter came soon, and I decided to move a small trailer onto the land to have a temporary place to stay. The winter scenery in this area is just beautiful, and capturing some glimpses of wildlife in the snow-covered country is a spectacular sight. Many times I've been out on a cold winter day, and just about the time I thought there wasn't a sign of a surviving soul, some critter would be out and about. After a long cold winter, spring had finally arrived. One springtime day, while I was out videotaping, out of a low cloudy sky came 2 trumpeter swans. The The swans landed only a few feet away from me, and I was most fortunate to capture the event on camera. The swans didn't seem shy at all, and I was able to actually sit with them. At one point, I was able to touch one of these big birds. A fully grown swan will weigh 20 to 30 pounds and will have a 7-foot wingspan. Trumpeters can live for 30 or more years, but the average lifespan in the wild is about 15 years. North America's largest waterfowl, the trumpeter swan, was once a prominent feature in Wisconsin's lakes and marshes. In 1805, when explorers Lewis and Clark first encountered these large snowy white birds, they were common throughout most of the northern United States and Canada. By the early 1930s, only 69 trumpeter swans were known to remain in the entire continental United States south of Canada. The last known breeding trumpeter swans vanished from Wisconsin in the late 1800s. I considered my encounter with the swans a rare privilege. Springtime is one of my favorite times for observing white-tailed deer at close range out in our meadow. The deer seem almost tame, and they are very curious by nature. My wife Ruth and I love to spend many early evening hours just going out and observing the deer. In the spring of 1992, I finally decided to build a log cabin. We first cleared the site and made a road back into the woods. I and my family began harvesting jack pines from our land, 80 trees to be exact. We then began to remove the bark off all the trees. This was a very tedious job, especially for beginners. I spent many hours reading books trying to learn how to build with logs. Then I searched for the various tools, but to my surprise, the people at the hardware stores would look at me dumbfounded and say, "What kind of tool do you need?" I finally began searching around old shops in Wisconsin and was able to find a few tools, such as draw knives, peaveys, and cant hooks. Tools used to remove bark from the trees, called peeling spuds, I made out of ice chisels. At some point, I decided that the pine trees that we had worked so hard to harvest and peel, to my disappointment, weren't big enough in diameter to build a log cabin. I then decided to use the logs by building a log privy. So I began to build a 6 by 6 foot privy. It took in my spare time most of the summer. I at that point met a fellow by the name of Ed Somm. Ed had built a log home just in back of my property and offered to teach me the art of log building as well as help me. We instantly became the best of friends. The method I chose to use for the privy was called the stack wall method. The logs are stacked and nailed between dimensional planking. I also decided to do full log gable ends to the roof peak. Well, it sounds simple, but it's still a lot of work. I used rough-sawn pine boards for the roof, and we chinked the cracks with mortar. Before the chinking was done, my wife Ruth put roofing nails every 3 inches into the walls to help hold the mortar in. That summer, I still had a dream of building a log cabin. I heard about some logs up in northern Minnesota. The large balsam logs were lying in a field near Duluth, Minnesota. Some of the logs were over 70 feet long. After giving it some thought, I decided to purchase the logs. The next thing I did was section up the logs according to a blueprint plan that me and my wife Ruth had previously drawn up. The only problem I faced was how to transport the logs to Grantsburg, Wisconsin. After hours of numerous phone calls, I located a logger outside of Duluth. The logger told me that he had a large logging truck with a jammer to load the logs. That summer, it rained constantly and we had to wait a number of weeks for the clay in that country to dry up enough to bring in a logging truck. Well, the big day finally came, and early one morning we headed back up north. When we arrived, it was raining very hard. The truck got buried in the soft clay soil halfway up the tires. It was quite a job to get the truck out. After we got the truck unstuck, we were able to back in and load the logs. When the logs were loaded, we had enough weight to make it to the main road. We followed the truck down the highway and headed for Grantsburg. Once we arrived at Grantsburg, my son Mark was standing by. I had previously towed in a bunch of logs with my pickup truck to use as skid logs. Skids are used to hold the logs off the ground, which helps prevent deterioration and also helps the logs in the drying process. When all of the logs were finally unloaded, we began to peel the bark off. It took us a solid week to finish. After a few weeks of the warm and breezy fall days, the logs were drying out quite well. I think the fact that we chose a knoll in the open meadow helped the drying process considerably. We finally decided on a 22 by 32 foot cabin with a loft and blueprinted a floor plan. Spring had finally arrived and we were more than anxious to start building the cabin. We actually were able to get underway in May of 1993. The first step was to find an experienced mason to help me stake out the site. I also needed help with the brickwork. I met up with a fellow from the Twin Cities who called himself the Old Country Mason. We decided to build on concrete piers and began by auging holes 12 inches wide and 48 inches deep into the ground. We then mixed and poured cement into each of the 19 drilled holes. Then the 8-inch blocks were floated on the cement. Steel rebar was inserted and cement was poured into the top of the blocks. When the piers were finished, the mason told us that all 19 piers overall measured only 1/16 of an inch off. Next we began to build the floor. We used 2x8 rough sawn lumber for the joists that we bought at a sawmill in Frederick, Wisconsin. We decided to install a 5-inch thickness foam between the joists to keep the cabin floor warm in the cold winter months. It was a tedious and messy job cutting the foam to size using a skill saw powered by a generator. Next, 3/4-inch plywood was screwed down as the decking material. With the constant rains that summer, I had to apply 2 coats of waterproofing on the decking, and we were constantly going up to the building site to sweep the rainwater off of the floor. The big day finally arrived, the day that we would actually start building with the logs. The first step was to flatten and put down the sill logs. Our friends from Grantsburg, Ed Somm and Jimmy Walker, as well as my son Mark, showed up early to help with the work. We picked out and snapped chalk lines on the biggest logs. Next, we kerfed the logs down to the chalk lines using chainsaws. There was always a man flagging on the opposite side of the log so that we wouldn't cut down too far. Using an axe, we chopped out large pieces of wood. Next, we flattened and smoothed the log by raking the bar of the chainsaw back and forth. It's a lot of work, but it works quite well. Before working with any log, all knots must be removed. One evening, while we were up at the cabin site, my son Mark found this cute baby skunk. The poor little thing must have gotten separated from its mother. When they are this small, they are virtually odorless. I even had to hold it before we released it back into the wild. We finished off the sill logs by laying down rolls of foam sill sealer. The logs were then secured to the floor using 12-inch spiral Ardox spikes. We felt a great sense of accomplishment when we completed the first round of logs. There are many kinds of notches you can use in log building, but we decided to use the Swedish cope, better known as the saddle notch. I needed some special tools for making the notches, and my friend Ed Somm made me a fishtail gouge and showed me how to make a mallet from an oak tree using a chainsaw. I learned to become very proficient in the use of a chainsaw. When operating a chainsaw, you must always practice safety first, and on the first onset of fatigue, call it a day. The balsam logs that we obtained in Duluth were not originally harvested to build a cabin with, so with the number of logs in our supply, we had to carefully plan how to use each and every log. In most log construction, the walls are erected and the door and window openings are cut out last, but because of our low log supply, we decided to erect the logs around all door and window openings. This in turn made construction both slower and harder. The logs we were using were severely tapered from butt end to top, which made using them a challenge. On one occasion, a log builder told me that he avoided using tapered logs to build with if at all possible. The difficulty in using tapered logs is in trying to keep the walls level. There are essentially two choices in log wall construction, one of which is chinked and the other chinkless. We chose the chinked method, meaning leaving gaps between the logs which later must be filled. My two sons, Mark and Kelly, as well as Ruth, helped with all of the log construction. The first step was to pick out a log from our log supply according to butt and tip diameter as well as length that would work the best. The log was then positioned on the wall and rolled with the cant hook, checking for any bows. If there was a bow in the log, as in most cases, the bow was placed outward. Then we would average how much of a gap we were going to have between the top and bottom log. After the log was leveled, it was secured from rolling using a tool called a log dog, which is temporarily driven into the logs. With the log positioned on the wall, an instrument called a scribes is used to mark the notch. The best way I can explain a scribes is to think of it as being similar to a compass used in drafting. The scribes we used had an indelible pencil attached to it used to trace the log below. The scribes we used were designed and made by my friend Ed Somm. We were going to be making the saddle notch for our copes. The first step was to set the scribes according to the gap between the upper and lower log. Then, using a board nailed to a tree that had marks completely level with the earth, the scribes' bubble levels are set both horizontally and vertically. Next, the lower log is traced to the upper log on both sides. The log is then scribed and ready to make the notch. The first step in making the notch is to chisel around the inside of the scribe mark using a mallet and gouge. This keeps the scribe mark from splintering. Using a chainsaw, the log is then kerfed down to the scribe mark. Large pieces of wood are then removed with an axe. Next, a fishtail gouge and mallet are used to remove about 1/2 inch of wood following the scribe mark. The idea is to leave the scribe mark. Using the bar tip of the chainsaw, the notch is completed by removing the remaining wood in a cupped-like manner. I personally like to use a Stihl Model 026 chainsaw with a 16-inch bar and chipper chain. The log is then placed back on the wall, rolled over, and checked for fit. In some cases, the log may not go down into place properly because of a knot or slight obstruction. The chainsaw may then be used by running the bar in between the top log and bottom log. This is known as marrying the logs and works quite well. The cope is then insulated by stapling some roll insulation to the inside of the notch. Using the cant hook, the log is rolled into place. We secured the logs by using 12-inch Ardox spiral spikes every 3 feet. We had a few large enough logs, so on the first couple of courses, I was able to scribe the whole length of the log, then cut out a V on the log's underside, making the log airtight, also known as the chinkless method. We nailed 2x2 sliders along all door and window jambs to allow for log settling. It also made for a more airtight fit. Now and then, a few of our neighbors would come by to check on the progress of the cabin. It seems that just about the time that we needed a little encouragement, Patty Bates, a lady experienced in log building projects, would drop by. Another Jack Pine neighbor, Jimmy Walker with his smiling face, would also from time to time stop by to pay us a visit or lend us a helping hand. That summer, we fought the frequent rains, and the gnats nearly drove us crazy. For the first few courses, we were able to lift the logs up on top of the walls using timber carriers and trying to recruit help. But when the walls reached a certain height, this technique became almost impossible. I then remembered reading an old logging book that had a picture of something called a jammer, and decided that I would try to build one. I bolted some logs together, making a 4-legged boom, approximately 18 feet high. I then attached a chain hoist to the top, and we tied the jammer off to a tree to keep it from falling over when lifting heavy logs. We were able to move the jammer around the cabin floor, moving the logs up and down on the wall that we were working on. The jammer worked well and was a lifesaver that made us more independent. We worked laboriously every weekend that summer, come rain or shine, mostly rain. We could usually finish 2 courses in a weekend. My son Mark, along with his brother Kelly, worked very hard. They became very proficient in the use of a chainsaw, and I was proud of the both of them. Using a chainsaw, we flattened all windowsills to accept the bucks. We found out that the trickiest part of building with our tapered logs was averaging and keeping the walls the same height. We were constantly measuring and adjusting the walls by using different log diameters. We knew that the walls had to be as even as possible side for side when we reached the top. In the front of the cabin, we were going to install an 8-foot wide window, and in the back, a 13-foot wide window. This posed a possible structural problem, knowing that the weight of the cabin's roof would rest directly over both windows. The problem soon became a long topic of discussion, especially among our neighborhood friends. After much thought, I finally decided to build my own window header beams. I knew that the beams would have to be strong enough to support the weight of the roof. For each beam, I ended up using 3 2x10 rough-sawn planks with plywood in between each plank. I then assembled each beam using glue and heavy spikes. The beams were very heavy, and we had to use the jammer to lift them over the window bucks and into place. When the walls finally reached 8 feet high, I knew that I needed some bigger and stronger logs to support the weight of both the loft and the roof. My friend Ed Somm told me that he had some large, very old jack pines that needed harvesting on his land. Ed told me that the trees were free for the taking, and I decided to take him up on his offer. The first thing I did was survey the trees, above all checking for straightness. I then tagged 28 large jacks, and along with my daughter Misty Marie, attempted to begin harvesting the trees. The weather was hot and bug infested, not to mention the dense area in which these trees stood. I suddenly realized that I was going to experience the art of becoming a so-called lumberjack and must become knowledgeable in the preciseness of felling trees in tight, dense quarters. My first attempts at felling the large 80-foot trees were disastrous. I hung up one tree after another, but believe it or not, I started to get the hang of it. I finally recruited the Burnett County Game Warden, who also happens to be my brother-in-law, Mike Smith. Mike showed up with one of his trusty rebuilt John Deere tractors and saved the day. Mike was practically born with a chainsaw in his hand and is precise at felling trees exactly where you want them. When we finally finished harvesting all of the 28 jack pines, Mike began dragging the logs to a central point in the woods. Once we had all of the logs centrally located, Mike began dragging 2 to 3 logs at a time, the 1 1/2 mile distance, over to our meadow. Mike and I both worked laboriously for 2 days to complete the back-breaking task. My daughter Wendy and her fiance Bill Baszler, along with Bill's 2 children, Amanda and Brian, began the jack pine peeling operation. Ruth, Misty, and I also helped to peel the logs as well. We rolled the logs with cant hooks and used draw knives and peeling spuds to remove the bark. Both Amanda and Brian used draw knives and helped diligently. We finally completed peeling the logs and could once again resume cabin construction. The log boom that I built wasn't tall enough and didn't have the strength to raise up the large jack pine tie logs. So once again, Ed Somm volunteered to help us. Ed came over with a steel boom that he made for the back of his tractor. We attached a chain hoist to the end of the boom, and the tractor had a hydraulic lift. The contraption made easy work of raising the logs on top of the cabin walls. The morning was cold and rainy, but everyone showed up to help. At this point, working on the cabin became slower and much more difficult. Two of the large pines that we had raised up on the wall were 32 feet long. They would be used to tie the door and window bucks into the walls. The sheer weight of these logs made maneuvering difficult. Some of the logs would be used to tie the walls together, known as the tie logs, which would also support the loft, and others would be used to support the gable end walls. After all the logs were placed on top of the cabin walls, they were tied down and secured. From here on out, all work had to be accomplished by using either planking or scaffolding. We first notched out and put all of the tie logs into place. On the loft end, we flattened all of the logs using the chainsaw. At this point, we made multiple copes in the plate log that went over the tie logs. A neighbor friend by the name of Joe Lindmeyer stopped by one day to pay us a visit and asked us if we needed any more logs. Joe said that he owned a tree farm not too far away and offered to supply us with some red pines at no charge. At that point, we decided to take him up on his offer and use the trees to make roof rafters. Once again, cabin building ceased and we were back to another logging operation. My two sons and I ended up harvesting approximately 80 nice red pines. My father came to watch one day and decided to buy me a four-wheeler to use to tow the logs with. So along with my brother Greg and some help from some other people, we used the four-wheelers to tow the logs with. My daughter Wendy and Bill Baszler came over and peeled the red pine rafters. The second winter had arrived and we decided to take a long-deserved break. Spring had finally arrived and I resumed building in April. The first thing I did was build a sort of portable sawmill to flatten the roof rafters to accept the roof boards. I used my four-wheeler to move the logs from the main supply up to the saw stand. I attached a device known as a Haddon lumber maker to the 16-inch bar of my Stihl 026 chainsaw. The idea was to slide the chainsaw down the planking, making an even cut on the side of the log. I cut just enough off of the side of the log to make an even enough surface on each rafter so that I could keep the roof boards as even and level as possible. The whole contraption worked quite well. I had a man make me some special chains for my chainsaw, which made ripping the logs a lot easier. Nevertheless, flattening the 38 rafters went very slow and gave me my share of backaches. After all the rafters were finished, we were finally able to resume working on the cabin. We met my two sons, Kelly and Mark, at the Cummings sawmill in Frederick, Wisconsin, to purchase some rough sawn planking for the loft floor. We bought most of our lumber supply from the Frederick mill. If the sawmill didn't have enough pre-cut lumber on hand to fill our order, they would accommodate us by custom cutting enough lumber to fill our order. All of the lumber we purchased was mostly white pine. A friend of ours loaned us a 16-foot tandem trailer that we used to transport all large building materials. We took the loft flooring to Hurdle, Wisconsin to have it planed. We prearranged to get the lumber for the cabin's main floor from the man who owned the planer. We spent a good part of the day searching through piles of stacked lumber, trying to pick out the best boards to plane for the main floor. The boards were 1 by 4 by 8 feet long. The planer was most impressive. It was designed and custom built by the owner, Bob Ron Portal. The machine is known as a four-sided planer and can actually plane, as well as tongue and groove, all four sides of a board in one operation. The owner showed Ruth and the boys how to plane the boards, and they actually did most of the work. The planer could be set to cut a shallow or deep tongue and groove. We first fed in the 2x8 by 14 foot loft boards, and then planed the 700 main floorboards. The rather large planer was also designed to be portable for on-site work as well. When we finally finished, we loaded the trailer as well as one rather overloaded pickup and headed for Grantsburg. It was time to build the loft. We fastened the 2x8 by 14 foot boards to the pre-flattened cross logs using large galvanized screws. The weather was hot and the job was long and back-breaking. Using a generator, I was able to make use of a screw gun. The last two boards had to be scribed and cut to meet the contour of the log sidewalls. With one half of a sunburned body, I finally finished the 22 by 14 foot loft. Next, we built some upright posts that would support the 38-foot main roof beam. We decided to build the roof 10 feet above the loft floor to allow for ample headroom. My brother Chris and I actually built the main beam in midair, which became very unnerving. We were at a height of 23 feet from ground level. The finished beam allowed for a 3-foot roof overhang on each gable end. We began putting up the red pine roof rafters. We installed the loft end rafters first. To raise the rafters, I installed a pulley inside a boxed frame and moved it along the top of the main beam, securing it with C-clamps. Using a rope come-along, I could then raise the logs to the main beam and hold them in place until they were fastened. The rafters were fastened to the main beam using lag screws, using an electric impact gun, and nailed to the sill logs using large 12-inch spikes. Using a large tarp, we made a tent over the loft end. This kept the loft floor dry in rainy weather. We then built the gable ends using 2x6 rough-sawn lumber. Provisions were made for 2 windows on the loft end. We used 12-inch wide rough-sawn pine boards for the roof. Because of the very steep pitch of the roof, we had to tie a rope around each man's waist and secure the rope over the top of the main roof beam. We used 30-pound felt paper over the roof boards, then laid on 3-inch thick sheets of foam for insulation. Particle board was then laid over the foam sheeting, followed by rolls of 30-pound roofing paper. My sister Angela and her husband Michael Smith came over and lent us a hand with the roof. I hired a local roofing company to nail on the shingles. We insulated the gable ends using 6-inch thick roll insulation. The outside of the gable ends were covered using rough-sawn pine. After the roof was finished, we installed all of the windows. We decided to use a synthetic chinking material to fill the log gaps. First, we had my stepdad, Ed Deering, cut various sizes of foam rod in half on a bandsaw. It was then stapled flat side out to the inside and outside gaps, which created an air pocket between the logs. We then used a chinking gun and trowels to apply the chink about a 1/4 inch thick. The chink was smoothed out by spraying and brushing out a mixture of water and alcohol. When synthetic chink is dry, it resembles cement and remains rubbery to absorb any log movement. It took Ruth and my daughter Wendy many hours to completely chink the whole cabin. I spent countless hours repairing any wood decay on the logs. I first filled all the bad spots using marine fiberglass, then smoothed all the areas with a handheld grinder. We installed the main floor next. 30-pound felt paper was laid over the subfloor to create a vapor barrier. Then we began blind nailing the pine tongue and groove floorboards down. The use of a radial arm saw made cutting the boards a lot easier. We had lots of help. One person would measure the boards and another would cut them to size. My nephew Jeff, along with my two sons, helped me nail the floor down. Some of the women were also of great help. We finished the 22 by 32 foot main floor in 3 days. We decided to build our own front and back exterior doors for the cabin. Elmer Menke, a family friend, volunteered his expertise. Rough sawn pine boards were clamped and screwed together. Felt roofing paper was inserted in between the double-thick crossbuck doors to keep the wind out. Elmer then planed each of the heavy 2-inch thick doors for a custom fit. The project took 2 full days to complete, and Elmer's handcrafted doors are truly a work of art. The strong, heavy doors are very rustic looking. It was late fall when we finished the interior walls and electrical work and started staining the outside of the cabin. We used a stain preservative called X100, which contains a paraffin base. I, along with my son Mark and daughter Wendy, undertook the task. Scaffolding had to be set up and moved several times. The 27 gallons of stain was applied using large staining brushes, which gave us better coverage and deeper wood penetration. The job took us 3 long days. In November of 1994, the project was complete, and my dream of building a log cabin retreat became a reality. At this time, I would like to give you a grand tour of the cabin's interior. All of the walls and doors were built using rough sawn pine boards. The main floor consists of a bathroom, furnace room, 2 walk-in closets, a master bedroom, a kitchen and dining area, and an open great room area. I'll start with the kitchen and dining area. There's a 7.5 foot long sink cabinet island, which was made at a technical college. The island was constructed using sugar pine for the inlaid cabinet, and the butcher block countertop was made by using rock maple. The restored granny hutch is the showpiece of the cabin and has a charm all of its own. The drop-leaf dining table, when fully extended, seats up to 10 people. I was lucky enough to find and refurbish a small old gas cook stove, complete with fancy chrome knobs. A neighbor donated a nice refrigerator with a large food capacity. The great room area has a large couch with 2 chairs, and looking through the 13-foot wide window observing wildlife is a favorite hobby of mine. There is also an old wood stove which is yet to be piped out. Most everything in the cabin, including chandeliers, furniture, blankets, linen, and artifacts, was hunted for and purchased at second-hand stores. The master bedroom consists of 2 restored dressers and a double bed. From the hallway, we can enter the closet, the bathroom, or the furnace room. The bathroom walls are tongue and grooved pine. There is a sink vanity, chemical toilet, and shower stall. There is no running water yet, and water heated on the stove is poured into a shower bag, which is hung in the shower stall for bathing. We can get at least 2 uses from a full 5-gallon bag. The utility room contains the electrical service box and furnace. The LP furnace is a 65,000 BTU forced air unit. It adequately heats the whole cabin with no cold spots. The cabin's electricity is powered by a 5,000 watt fuel efficient generator which runs up to 13 hours without refueling. The generator powers the cabin's 29 lights, ceiling fan, refrigerator, and furnace blower all at one time with little effort. My grandson Brian and I built the loft steps, complete with log side rails. The spacious 14 by 22 foot loft with a 10-foot high ceiling has 2 twin beds, 2 dressers, and 1 full-size bed. The loft floor is 9.5 feet from the main floor, and the peak of the cathedral ceiling is 19 feet from the main floor. The large ceiling fan helps to maintain the same heat. My daughter Wendy was enjoying some holiday ice fishing on a nearby lake and stopped in to show off her whopper 18-pound northern pike. Wendy is an avid fisherman and really knows the sport quite well. She sure had the right to be proud that day. As I reflect back on the total experience of building the log cabin on our land, now known as the Wild Places, I can recall many unforgettable times. You see, for me, it wasn't just the idea of building and having a cabin. It was living out a dream. It was people coming together, but most of all, sharing with others. Our laborious reward was a log cabin, a place where people can gather and share new experiences. To me, the cabin at times is also a place of solitude. It's a place of freedom in a setting of still somewhat the wild places. In the early spring of 1994, my youngest brother Chris came to help me on the cabin. I shared with him my knowledge of log building. He learned fast how to make a Swedish cope with an oak mallet and a gouge. He also bravely worked on the roof's main beam assembly. I lost my brother that fall at the young age of 37 years old. The last time I saw my brother Chris was in our meadow. This made the cabin a very special place to me. In future years to come, at times I will use the cabin as sort of a base camp for making video documentaries on wildlife. I surely found much satisfaction learning to build with logs and would encourage anyone who wants to give it a try. I will always have the desire to try and make something using logs. A showplace to us, our handcrafted log cabin, will give us a true sense of accomplishment for many years to come. I would like to thank all of the great and wonderful people who helped us in many ways. Some of the greatest experiences weren't captured on videotape, and I plan to write a book in the near future. Other than my wife Ruth, I forgot to mention my most faithful four-legged companion through it all, my dog Katie, better known as the Log Dog. I sincerely hope that you enjoyed our story, and at this time want to thank you for joining us.